Hello and welcome to 19 of World History, week 19 I should specify. We're going to be getting a little bit deeper today into early exploration of North America, and we're going to take a look back. I shouldn't say a look back, it's not a look back, right? But sort of revisit the Protestant Reformation and sort of its latest iteration as again, Europe is beginning to tire of the bloodshed that's been associated with this, but there are still very much issues. And we're going to close with a story that kind of visits back to one of the topics we talked about last week in Jamestown. We're going to start, though, north of the border in Canada. If you want to know why Canada has so many things with French names and French origin, that's because it was the French explorers, not the English explorers, who were the first Europeans to move across Canada. We talked earlier about Jacques Cartier, French explorer who went to Canada and made some relationships with some of the native tribes there and established the lucrative fur trade. Beaver was very, very plentiful throughout Canada, still is. And it just so happens that their pelt was very good for making the felt hats that were becoming very popular in Europe, and of course other things, certainly a lot more practical things. But Jacques Cartier did establish the fur trade, but he did not establish a colony. He lived there for a while, but it was not the establishment of a permanent colony. But of course, the money that he and others started making from the fur trade attracted other people to Canada. Now, again, there are explorers, of course, looking for gold and all that, but in Canada, with the natural resources of the lumber and the beavers and other wildlife, there was, for all practical purposes, their own version of gold. There were resources in Canada where you could make money on. We're going to focus this week on two Frenchmen who were big early explorers in what turned out to be the permanent French settlement of Canada. We're going to start with Samuel de Champlain. He was kind of a jack of all trades, well educated. He, according to his contemporaries, he had a good mind for trade, geography, exploration, navigation, negotiation, and was just an all-around crackerjack fella. His ambition was to settle what we now call the city of Quebec. He first arrived there in 1608, or about a year after the settlers at Jamestown landed. He set up permanent buildings that surrounded them with basically the equivalent of about a 15-foot wide moat. But much like in Jamestown, the first Canadian settlers had a hard time adapting to the elements. Only 9 of the first 28 colonists survived between scurvy, smallpox, and of course the bitter Canadian cold. Now, Champlain tried to associate with the nearby natives. He actually made a good faith effort and was successful in some instances in reaching out and establishing bona fide relations. He would join the Algonquins in their battle against their enemy, the Iroquois. Now, unfortunately, his reaching out to the Algonquins meant that he had to make war on the Iroquois, and that led to a war that lasted about 100 years. The French and Indian War was a very long, protracted affair, and we can talk about that later, but suffice to say it began with Samuel de Champlain reaching out to the Algonquins in the region. The Iroquois were very, very powerful throughout Canada. They had as many in their tribe as most all the others combined, I believe. He did sincerely try to understand the native people of Canada. He tried to get to know them. He established very good relations. He respectfully involved native inhabitants on the expeditions that he took around his region looking for resources. His home country, though, was still determined to find that northern passage to Asia, where they would not have to put up with the Spanish, Portuguese, and English ships and the privateering and pirating that's going on through the southern path to Asia. They wanted a northern path that they could use on their own. Of course, they had no idea of just how vast Canada was. Now, if you look at it on this map, you see, again, the Canadian mainland north of the 48th parallel. It's 54th parallel, I should say. It's odd. Today, 2/3 of Canada's population lives below the 54th parallel. Most of it's scrunched to the south. The north is mostly vast wastelands, Arctic. When you get up here to the Baffin Islands and all that, you can probably, it's like a little maze here where you can draw the line through all these islands and whatnot. And of course, keep in mind that about half the year it's basically all frozen, so you're not going to get any ship through there. Again, the French had no idea of how vast Canada was. But again, it was abundant with resources, between the trees and the fur. And so Champlain had sort of pressure from the folks who were sponsoring his trip to get out and explore and tell us if we can find this northern passage to Asia. He continued to befriend the Algonquin Indians, made peace with the Huron Indians. He continued to battle the Iroquois. De Champlain was, unlike so many other explorers we hear about, someone who was genuinely interested in doing a square deal with the natives. He brought Christian missionaries with him, of course, to share the gospel. But again, he was genuinely interested in not enslaving the indigenous population. So plus to him. Now, another obstacle to his mission, of course, would be the English. While they're settling down in Jamestown and up the Jamestown Peninsula, they start hearing about all this great fur trade to their north, way to their north. Of course, there was no Canada versus England or Canada versus U.S. then. It was all one big continent, so it was just way up north. It wasn't another country they were looking at. So Champlain was taken prisoner and shipped to England. He was ultimately released, but he was very popular among the people and returned to Canada to continue to try to improve the relations between the French settlers and the natives. The second name we're going to talk about is named Henry Hudson. He had 4 separate journeys to Canada. Again, another one trying to find that northern passage to Asia. Of course, it did not work. That was the purpose of his first journey. His second journey, he sailed again from England to North America, looking again for that northern passage, and again the second attempt was a failure just like the first. Now in 1609, again we're Jamestown plus 2 here, he tried a new trading company. He went to work for a Dutch company, Dutch East India Company. In England it was considered treason to sail under the banner of another country, but Henry Hudson didn't really care. He was arrested for treason, but he was acquitted of it. Now, the third journey was very weird because he actually came to North America well south of where Jamestown is, probably down around Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. So he continued to hug the coast, went up a stream, and eventually found his way up in the middle of a vast expanse north of Virginia and south of where the Canadian settlers were, the French settlers. This is now called the Hudson River. It dumps out into New York, into the Atlantic, but it goes all the way up into the mainland to the modern-day capital of New York State, Albany. In 1610, he started his 4th and final voyage to the New World. He entered what is now called the Hudson Straits when you reach America. Again, it wasn't called the Hudson Strait then, but oddly enough, he went to what is now called the Hudson Bay. That is a huge body of water in the center of northern Canada. And, of course, his crew was under the impression that they were trying to find that elusive northwest or northern passage to Asia. But what Hudson did, if you look at the map here, he just sort of hugged the coast of the Hudson Bay and charted it, mapped it, and his crew began to suspect that he was actually trying to scout out fur trading posts for his friends. and not trying to find the northern passage to Africa. Now, it did not help that they were running out of food, that scurvy was abundant, and everyone was ticked off. Eventually, there was a mutiny. Hudson and his son and 7 other people were set adrift on a boat off of the main ship, and they were never heard from again. Of course, that meant the creation of all kinds of legends about what really happened to Henry Hudson. But for our purposes, Hudson was the most, I guess we could say prolific, but certainly the explorer who did the most to map Canada early on. And he's got a river in New York named after him, a strait in Canada named after him, and of course the great big old Hudson Bay is named after him. So he's got that going for him, which is nice. All right, we're going to resume and talk a little bit about religion here. Again, the Protestant Reformation, at this point in history, is about 80 years old, but it had already taken quite a toll. We talked about, of course, how it played out in Germany, where Martin Luther nailed the theses on the cathedral at Wittenberg, and we saw how it played out in Switzerland, where the formation of the Anabaptists, who took not only a dim view of the Catholic Church, but they rejected everything the Church was about. They were very, very much on personal salvation through grace and faith and not through works. We saw how it was playing out in the Netherlands, in Holland, where the Spanish still controlled that area, but a lot of the people had been bitten by the Protestant Reformation bug and wanted to form their own. The movement in Scotland created what were called Presbyterians, and of course we know about the history in England, where Henry VIII, for mostly personal reasons, separated or basically took England out of the Roman Catholic Church, basically told the Pope to get lost, and did not create a new church, but he kind of did. Basically, what was left over after they booted the Catholics out of the cathedrals was what would be called the Church of England. Well, under Henry's daughter Elizabeth, the Church of England would get a name and a purpose. It came to be known as the Anglican Church. Now, Elizabeth I was not, terribly religious herself, not overtly so anyway, but because of these conflicts, particularly with the strong Catholic population in the Scotland region, she just wanted peace. And again, all of the time while she's weighing whether or not to behead Mary Queen of Scots, who was a Catholic, very notable Catholic, someone supported by Catholics. And so she wanted to come up with a church that would kind of strike the happy medium between Protestantism and Catholicism. Of course, what's the old saying that if you try to please everybody, you end up pleasing nobody? Well, the Anglican Church, and you can still see it today in some of the vestments and some of the rituals that take place during the services of the Anglican Church. If you squint real hard, it looks like a Catholic Mass. A lot of the things that made Catholics Catholic were maintained in the Anglican Church. Not the big stuff, though. Again, absolution through a priest, they didn't have that and still don't. But suffice to say, the hardcore Protestants didn't like it and the hardcore Catholics didn't like it. And that made for sort of a plurality of the people there. Divisions over faith continued in England. The Protestant movement kind of slipped into 2 broad groups. You had the Puritans and the Separatists. The difference between them was the Puritans believed that the Anglican Church needed to be purified. They thought it could be fixed. They did not like some of the Anglican ceremonies, the use of symbols, the overuse, they said, of symbols like crosses, even wedding rings. They did not like that because it was a Catholic symbol. The Separatists, on the other hand, agreed that the Anglican Church wanted all that, but they didn't want it to be reformed. They wanted it to be abolished, or at least they wanted to be able to separate it from it altogether. They saw it was beyond repair in their estimation, and they just wanted to be they wanted to start a brand new Church of England. They were the smaller group, were the Separatists, ended up being the most persecuted. Again, the violence continued, mostly played out in little villages, but sometimes in big cities as well, where the Separatists were scorned even by sometimes the Puritans, who were sort of on the same side as them, but just not quite as ardent, I suppose. These were all, Separatists and Puritans were kind of derogatory names given to these people. We'll introduce you again to a fellow named John Smith. We talked about John Smith last week. Problem is, that is a different John Smith. The John Smith that became governor of the Jamestown colony is different than the John Smith who separated himself from the Anglican Church. Big difference. This Smith is spelled with a Y. That's all you need to know. He, as an ordained Anglican priest, saw that the Anglican Church was not following through on just good, sound Protestant doctrine. He separated himself in 1606 and set up an independent church in Gainsborough, England. But again, persecution followed them, and the entire congregation fled to Amsterdam in the Netherlands, not far. His idea was to set up a church that as closely as possible mirrored the description of the church as it was given in the book of Acts, the first Christian church. He believed in personal salvation by faith through the acceptance of Christ. He believed that baptism was only for those who had experienced personal salvation. They did not agree with the Catholic and, for some, the Anglican doctrine of baptism of infants to make sure they go to heaven. Baptism of infants, according to Smith, was not according to Scripture. If some of these arguments sound familiar, it's because Protestants had really been making them for about 80 years at this point. These were just key Protestant red dog issues right here. Again, there are some Christians today even that accept infant baptism. Most don't, but just in fair disclosure, there are some Christians that still believe in that if you're baptized as an infant, that is sufficient. Now, here's the complicating part of all this. John Smith, during his life, changed his views on baptism. He came to accept infant baptism. Because of the confusion, Smith was asked to leave by his own church. He actually fled to a Mennonite church nearby, and he died while still living in Holland. So when we talk about the formation of the Baptist denomination, some will point to Smith and his insistence on believers' baptism as putting him as one of the early Baptists, if you want to call it that. Well, it's a sticking point. A few years ago, the Baptist denomination celebrated its 400th anniversary, going back to Smith. Problem is, the Anabaptists that were active in Switzerland, modern-day Zurich, predated him by several decades. If you want to try to find the lineage of the modern-day Baptists, I think you have to go back to the Anabaptists of Switzerland. But anyway, John Smith did establish the first English church, anyway, that was founded on the principles of believers' baptism. That much you can't deny. All right, we're going to close out Week 19 by talking about someone we talked about last week, Pocahontas. We mentioned last week that the daughter of Chief Powhatan was eventually sort of became a liaison between the natives and the colonists. And, of course, John Smith, I'm talking about Governor John Smith now, not the preacher, he almost certainly fabricated a story about Pocahontas jumping into her father's arms just as he was ready to bring down the axe and behead John Smith, begging to save his life, and he listened to her. Well, that almost certainly didn't happen because this John Smith was quite a fabulist. That's a nice way of saying he lied a lot. But anyway, so that's what we talked about in terms of Pocahontas last week. The story doesn't end there. Now, again, the story did not play out like you saw it in the movie, okay? Let's just get that out of the way now. That should not be surprising to you. There are very, very, very few biopics that have even 50% historical accuracy. The truth is not as entertaining as fiction. But again, she ended up being sold out, kidnapped, married, and a mother, and had a very full life. It's really one of the more remarkable stories that we've covered so far, and just in terms of its improbability of all of the events happening that really should not have happened, but they did. And it's her birth name was Matoaka, and of course we have Matoaka as a city in Virginia now. It was called. She was nicknamed Pocahontas because it means the naughty one, the spoiled child, or the one who plays a lot. Evidently, she was quite a mischievous little girl. In 1609, John Smith, again, the one she allegedly saved from her father, had to go back to, he was injured very badly from a gunpowder explosion and went back to England for treatment. After he sailed back, for some reason, the settlers told Pocahontas that he had died. There's no reason for them to have told her that. No one's ever really explained that, but they did say, oh, he died. So, but she continued, though, to carry messages from her tribe to the colonists and vice versa. She would bring them corn. There's even written accounts of her learning cartwheels from the colonist boys. At some point, though, 4 years later, when Pocahontas was probably still like a late teen, not even 20, I don't think, she was captured by a ship captain named Samuel Argball. He bribed a Native American couple if they would help lure Pocahontas aboard his ship, and when he did, he declared her a prisoner and held her for ransom. Now, I told you last week about her father, Chief Powhatan, being kind of a moody fellow, hot and cold with colonists. Well, for whatever reason, he did not meet their ransom demand. Don't know if it was because he was incapable or unwilling, but he would not give the ship captain everything that he wanted. So for a year, Pocahontas remained in captivity with the European settlers, mostly aboard the ship. She was taken on shore some, though, and moved to a secondary English settlement called Henricus. If that sounds familiar, you know of Henrico County, just outside of Richmond. She was treated well, taught English, taught the basics of the Christian faith. We don't know if Pocahontas ever made a profession of faith. Well, actually, she did make a profession of faith, I think. Whether or not it was true, only she and God knows, actually. She was baptized. She took even the English name of Rebecca. But she went a step further. On April 5th, 1614, she married an English widower, one of the colonists, named John Rolfe. Native Americans speculated she only married to gain her freedom, which might have been true. From what Rolfe's love letter said, he truly did love her. The marriage did work for a time in helping create peace between the Native Americans and the European settlers. Even Chief Powhatan gave the couple some property and a cottage along the James River. So evidently his cold heart melted a little bit. About a year later, they had a baby boy that they named Thomas, the first child that we think that was born in the Jamestown colony. You'll remember Virginia Dare was born in the aborted Roanoke colony a few years back. As time passed, John Rolfe decided to take his wife and his child back home to England. The English were excited at the idea. This had to be interesting to the people of England to have one of the savages from this strange new world that they're talking about. There was probably political motivation on both sides. The 12 of Pocahontas's fellow tribes members went with her to copy her entourage of what. There's ample evidence that they were sent there by Chief Powhatan to do some scouting to make sure see what their defenses are, see if whatever. And of course, there was. From the colonists' point of view, a desire to show the people of England that their investments in these colonies are paying some kind of dividends. Once in England, though, Pocahontas evidently fully adopted the ways of the English. She dressed like a proper English lady. the English nobility adored her and treated her just like royalty. She was invited to balls, banquets, dances, and plays, including one written by Shakespeare. Oddly enough, she saw John Smith, remember the captain whom she told was died? She ran into him in England. Awkward. But anyway, John Smith, finding that Pocahontas was in England, wrote to the Queen of England to say that Pocahontas had been kind to him once, and it prompted the Queen to invite Pocahontas to court. At least that's how the story goes. Again, we may never have known what it actually transpired. The sad part of the story is Pocahontas and her husband and their son were getting ready to head back to America, but just before they were to depart, Pocahontas fell ill. She died at the age of either 21 or 22, depending upon who you listen to, from a bad case of pneumonia, smallpox, tuberculosis. It was never really reported. She never boarded the ship that returned to the New World. She died in England, was buried there at St. George's Church. You have to wonder what Chief Powhatan thought about all this, but there's no evidence that he was hostile about it or bore any ill feelings. Now, the bad side of the story is after Chief Powhatan died, fighting broke out between the settlers and the Native Americans, and the Powhatan Nation would not survive that war. Anyway, that's something we'll be talking to you about later, but the story of Pocahontas is just remarkable. To go from, at this point in history anyway, to go from an indigenous person born in North America to become a high society roller in England 10,000 miles away. The odds against that happening at that point in history are just incalculable. It is a wonderful story. She died way too soon. It would have been interesting to see what she would have been like over the next several decades as a sort of a cultural and even political liaison between the old world and the new world. Anyway, we'll see you Monday.